Well, now that I've shown you a little bit of information about @FontFace and some places where you can find some interesting fonts, now let's take a look at how to implement those fonts into our work. Well, the nice thing about Font Squirrel that I mentioned to you earlier was the simple fact that when you actually download the files that we did, and if you remember at the end of the last video, we placed all of the necessary files into the fonts folder of our progress folder. So it's right next to it, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. But I do want you to note that in the file that's downloaded, when you go through the generator here, Web Font Kit, as I mentioned, you'll see that there is a sample style sheet, stylesheet.css. So if you open up that style sheet, you'll see here, generated by Font Squirrel. And right now it has all of the pertinent information that you will need if you are going to be working with that particular font. So I will ask you, and trust me, if you're not familiar with how to do FontFace and you're having problems, just do this. Just copy this information that we happen to have right here, and you're usually going to run into, very few, if any, problems. So I'm going to come into my CSS style sheet design, and right after I want to keep it fairly close to the top, just because I want this to be declared before any of the body information does. So in here, I'm just copying the same information that I had before when we were working with the downloaded file that Font Squirrel gave us. Okay, now, so let's take a look at the structure of our environment here, and I'll show you in just a second. So in HTML5 version 2, here's the progress files. If you remember, this is where we put the chunk 5 files in the fonts folder. So we're in the CSS folder and we want to get to the fonts folder. So what we need to do in here is to go back a couple of directory structures, and that's just exactly what I'm going to do. So everywhere where I see chunk 5 here, searching for the URL, I'm going to say go back one directory structure and go into the folder called fonts. Then find me chunk 5 web font EOT. So I'm going to come in here and we're going to implement that a couple of times. That's all I really need to do at this moment. But here where it says chunk 5, actually take the quotation marks too, even though it's camel case, and usually you only use those quotation marks when you are declaring something that has more than one word in its name, but we're still going to do it. It probably would work best this way. So check it out. Here where I have my H1s, my H2s, and my H3s, instead of using Georgia or Times New Roman or Times or any serif, I'm going to declare instead chunk 5 Roman, comma, and then Georgia. So if they don't have chunk 5 for whatever reason, although we've given them all the files, so there should be no problem, substitute that for Georgia. Okay, so I'm going to save this now, and let's take a look in our browser and see what's up. So here is the original Georgia, but if I press on the refresh, wow, check it out, a nice slab serif that I can use, and it gives a very distinctive look to the entire design. It looks so much different than it did just a second ago. Now I would reserve this one specifically for headlines, and maybe not even for these article headlines, but rather just the headline up here. But that's a great example of how we can use a nice slab right there. So that's what I want you to do, is explore Font Squirrel, look at some of the fonts, download something from the generator, open up the CSS, and copy that CSS information directly into your file. Fix the directory structure, right? So depending on where your CSS folder is, you might have to go out of the CSS, into the fonts, and then find your file. So that's exactly what I've done here. And then anywhere where you had a font family, just now substitute your particular font. Now, some other things I should bring to your attention. For example, you may want to use a secondary font instead of, for example, some body text that you're using here, or any number of different things that are available to you. As you can see in the example that we have in the final one, I actually have a few declarations. Linden Hill is for my headlines, and Linden Hill Italic was for the little subline and also in the footer. And Junction Regular is what I'm using for my regular body text. So if we were to come into the past the navigation, which is also using Linden Hill Italic for the rollover effect. See that? And here you can see Linden Hill Italic is used in the footer H3 section. So just remember that if you are going to be adding more than one font, right, it's not enough to just say bold, or you have to use a bold font. It's not enough to just say, oh, make this italic. You should be using an italic font. So here I have 3 separate font face declarations, and that allows me now to have access to 3 separate different types of fonts that I can work with. Although I must suggest, for the sake of design purposes, you should probably reserve, 2 fonts tops on the page. Maybe if you're pushing it 3, but certainly don't go nuts and start putting in 7 different fonts. That's not going to help your design. I promise you that much. So try to limit it, to personally, I don't even need Junction Regular in my final version. I just left it there so that you could experiment if you wanted to and see what that looks like. But if you're working along in the progress, right, remember that it's fairly easy. I've just added 1 in my progress file, but remember, if you wanted to add more fonts, then just copy that information that you get when you download it from your Font Squirrel, and that's usually going to help you and avoid any problems. But it's fairly easy to understand. We're implementing the EOT files for Internet Explorer. The URL for the WOFF is here. TrueType fonts, the SVGs, which also work on mobile devices. Everything's all here. And then we're just referring to Chunk 5 Roman a little later on. So that's it for Add Font Face. Have some fun with some fonts and come back in the next video.